Good to go. Welcome. My name is David Dalton. I was a professor of biology at Reed College in Portland for 32 years. I taught numerous courses, including a course on the biology of Lewis and Clark, which is kind of what I want to talk to you about tonight. The material I have is going to look at the events surrounding the initial observations of Lewis and Clark. We'll explore the journal somewhat. They're a wonderful resource. Then we'll fast forward to look at issues in modern biology related to the findings of Lewis and Clark. So things like ecosystem, conservation, climate change, uh, species endangerment, things like that. We'll spend some time talking about that. Okay, so here's the map of the route, which most of you are familiar with. 1804, 1806, first winter in St. Louis, then a winter in Fort Mandan, North Dakota, and then out to the coast at Fort Clatsop, and then back. This was, of course, the brainchild of Thomas Jefferson, who was very interested in exploring the West. He was the most knowledgeable man in the world about the American West. Louisiana Purchase had just gone through, and the country needed to know what they bought. So Jefferson conceived this whole plan. Even though he was the most knowledgeable man about the West, he really didn't know that much about it. For instance, he assumed that the mountains of Virginia were the tallest in North America, and that the landscape of the American West would be gentle rolling hills, well-watered forest, suitable for agriculture, as was the case in Virginia. Of course, things turned out to be very, very much different. It's not advancing.
Hit the arrow. All right.
That's too far. There. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the key players, because we are going to do some history and some anthropology and some humanities type stuff. It's not just biology. In fact, it's not all biology at all. So we'll start talking about Thomas Jefferson, who was this incredible genius. He, of course, conceived the notion. He had earlier visions of an expedition as long as 10 years before. But he went to Congress and got the $2,500 to fund the expedition. Then he recruited Lewis and Clark, and he wrote a long set of instructions for Lewis and Clark to be following on their journey, what they were to look for, including woolly mammoths and giant ground sloths, which Jefferson thought might still be extant in the West because the fossils were well known in the East. In fact, Jefferson wrote the first scientific article on paleontology about giant ground sloth fossils that were returned to him from West Virginia. So amazingly productive man. So that's Jefferson. Meriwether Lewis, of course, was the prime moving force. He was Jefferson's private secretary for 2 years, so Jefferson knew him well. He was a very skilled naturalist. He knew pretty much all the plants and animals of the East, which is important because when he saw stuff in the West, he could tell when something was new and not known from the East. His mother was an herbalist, and she taught him all the plants of the woodlands around West Virginia. William Clark was recruited he was a great commander of men. He had a military background, and he also wrote journals. Lewis and Clark wrote a long journal. It's 11 volumes long. It's huge, very useful information. But Clark wrote a journal too, and mostly it was just copying Lewis's journal. So they'd have two copies in case something happened to one of them. Unfortunately, Lewis was subject to bouts of depression that sometimes went on for months, where he didn't write anything at all in his journal. So Clark filled in and filled the void there to provide a continuous record of the expedition. Benjamin Barton was a professor, lived in Philadelphia. He was known as the American father of botany, knew a lot of botany. He was a friend of Thomas Jefferson's. Jefferson knew that Lewis needed to know botany, so he sent Lewis to work with Barton on a 3-week crash course in botany. And he learned a lot. For instance, he learned scientific names. He learned how to preserve plant specimens in a plant press, which allowed him to return many plant specimens back to Philadelphia. Over 130 plant specimens came back, and they're still extant in museums in Philadelphia. Frederick Persch was a German botanist who happened to be in Philadelphia at the time, a confidant of Barton. And Barton suggested that Persch be hired to catalog the specimens when they got back. So that's what happened. He was paid $70. It took him 2 years, and he eventually published a book on the flora of North America. Bernard McMahon, you may recognize that name for Mahonia, which is Oregon grape. Anyway, McMahon lived in Philadelphia. He was a seed supplier, an orchardist, and just a general botanizer who specialized in gardening. So he was responsible for working with Persch on some of the plants that were returned. The most obvious plant that came out of the expedition is bitterroot, Lewis's bitterroot, Lewissia rediviva. This was named by Persch. It's a very, very pretty plant. It's found in central Washington, eastern Oregon. It's especially common in the center of Montana in the Bitterroot Valley. The Indians loved this plant. They ate it heartily, and they ate lots of it. It was one of their main food items. Lewis tried it and couldn't stomach it. It was too bitter for him. So he gave the remnants back to the Indians, and they ate it heartily. So what else about Lewissia that's interesting? It's an extremely hardy plant. It survived as a plant specimen in Lewis's plant press all the way from Montana to Philadelphia, so many months in the bottom of the canoe. It got back to Philadelphia as this dried specimen that had been sitting for 6 months in the bottom of the canoe. Lewis gave it to McMahon, the gardener I was telling you about in Philadelphia. McMahon nursed it back to life after this incredible long journey with no water, no soil, no sunlight for 6 months, and the plant revived easily. Consequently, Persch named the species rediviva, so it's Lewissia rediviva. Rediviva means restored to life. So where do you find it? Bitterroot Mountains in Montana. There's the Bitterroot River, Bitterroot Valley, and so forth. Extremely common, and as I said, a major food source for the Indians. And there's a little quote from the journals. The journals were extremely valuable information. They consist of 11 volumes that fill up the whole library shelf. They are now available online, so you can search for keywords and so forth. But there's what Clark had to say about it, or Lewis had to say about it. A very bitter taste, which was nauseous, and transferred to the Indians, who ate them heartily. Supposedly, a small sack of bitterroot roots was sufficient to purchase a horse. What about Clark? Quite a few things were named for Clark, perhaps most notably Clark's nutcracker, which is found in the forests of Idaho. It's also found in Oregon and Washington in the high Cascades, wherever there is white bark pine. So Clark wrote these bird of the woodpecker kind, which feed on pine birds. That's true. And then a little bit about the appearance of the bird. It's actually a corvid. And when this got written up into the journal, Lewis has said this was a corvid. This is the bird family of jays, crows, and ravens. And nutcrackers are in that family, and Lewis recognized that, and he knew what corvids were. There's the tree that the Clark's nutcracker is primarily interested in, Pinus albicaulis. It grows at timberline. Here it is in Oregon, but you have it in Washington and Idaho. It's very widespread in Idaho. It lives in very harsh, rough conditions. The pine cones do not open unless a Clark's nutcracker hammers away at them and splinters it open to obtain the seeds, which are very large for a pine tree, very large and nutritious, about as nutritious as a glob of butter. This is what Clark's nutcracker eats exclusively. They collect the seeds, they bury them in the ground in seed caches, which they return to throughout the year. They have the amazing ability to remember up to 25,000 locations for the seed caches. Of course, sometimes the seed caches get neglected and ignored or forgotten, in which case the seeds germinate. And this is the way that white bark pine rejuvenates itself. So it's a very tight relationship between the bird and the pine. Unfortunately, there are some problems with that wonderful arrangement between the bird and the pine. And one of the problems is a blister rust, which is killing the white pines, the white bark pines. In many areas, up to 50% of the trees have been killed. So this is a big issue in conservation. There are efforts underway to develop trees that are resistant to blister rust, but that takes a long time. Another current problem with white bark pine is climate change. Things are warming up. The trees need to migrate upwards in elevation. As I said, they're timberline species. There's not that much territory left for them to migrate up to. So that's a problem for the nutcracker. The white pine is struggling from a disease and also from climate change. So that's a brief preview of what I will talk about in my presentations. There's some science, but I'm going to try to emphasize history, anthropology, modern issues of conservation biology, climate change, and so forth. Hope that's enough. Thank you for listening.